Okay, so 3 years ago, my daughter Kaylee gave birth to a little girl named Annabelle, and she had a lot of physical problems, and about 3 months later, the Lord took her home. And many of you suffered through that with us as a family and prayed for us, and since that time, Kaylee's had a couple more miscarriages, but Monday, she gave birth to a little girl. I want you to meet Ophelia, Belle, and Zaldo. Let me show you a picture of her, and there she is. And so we're really jazzed about that, and since many of you suffered with us through that, I wanted you to rejoice with us in it as well. So this is number 6 grandchild. I know I don't look old enough. Neither of us, of course, Kathy, look old enough for 6 grandchildren, but nevertheless, that's the case. And of course, with grandchildren, you spend a lot of time with them. They're all here in the Austin area, and one of the things you do is you read books to them. And you read lots of books, a lot of little kid books. And there's a particular book that I want to tell you about, and it's about Hattie the Proud Hen. Hattie was a proud hen. She was very proud, really had a very high view of herself. In fact, Hattie the Proud Hen deals with her pride, really the hubris of a hen, if you can believe it. And in fact, the book begins, "I'm a very fine hen, a smart little hen, no ordinary hen am I. Let the other hens talk, I won't give a squawk. I'm telling this place goodbye." And so Hattie takes off because all those around her are way below her. She sees herself elevated, and so she goes off through life, and things don't really work well. She gets a little isolated, and she ends up kind of being humbled, as you might imagine, in this book. And today, we're going to look at another proud hen, not one named Hattie, but one named Haman. And if you've been with us in our study in the book of Esther, you recognize that Haman is kind of the bad guy in the story. You may remember that Haman becomes offended by Mordecai, who is a Jew. Mordecai won't bow down to the proud hen, Haman. Try to say that several times. Mordecai won't, and so Haman overreacts and says, okay, I'm not only going to take you out, Mordecai, I'm going to take all your people out. I'll take all the Jews out. And so the people of God are under threat because of that. Let me just kind of show you quickly a chart in case you are just here for the first time, just to kind of catch you up with where we've been. So this is the book of Esther. We could call the book of Esther the confidence in providence, the God working behind the scenes. The series that we're developing is really called Perspective, Seeing the Unseen, that we kind of need to, as believers and followers of Christ, live our lives with confidence that God is at work in unseen ways, invisible ways, but nevertheless, many times dramatic ways to carry out his purposes through his people. And so the last time we were together with Esther, we learned kind of a definition of faith, that faith is being able to take risks for the purposes of God while resting in the promises of God and relying on the providence of God, that God's at work. And so just kind of very quickly, there's this tension and resolution. And the first 2 chapters, we're really talking about how God put Esther in the role of influence. And so chapter 1, Queen Vashti is removed for her rebellion. And chapter 2, God opens the door for this Jewish woman, Esther, to be elevated to the role of queen. And then in chapters 3 and 4, we find out the predicament. So that's where the bad guy Haman is offended, and he talks the king into signing off on a decree for all the Jewish people in the entire world empire of the Persians, that they on one day, basically in December, the last month of the year, that they would all be wiped out, that they were going to be killed and exterminated. And so Mordecai, the cousin to Esther, kind of challenges Esther, like, maybe for this very reason you've been put in this place, and like, you need to go to the king. And she explains, well, I haven't been summoned by the king for 30 days. And you can't just walk into the king's room. Like, you have to be summoned. In fact, if you do so, it's life and death, unless, of course, the king extends the scepter. And so in chapters 3 and 4, you find out that that seems to be a very rare occurrence, and this is very dangerous and very risky. It's life and death. But nevertheless, Esther agrees to do it. And so now we come to chapter 5. We're actually going to look at 3 chapters today. I know that scares you, but it's only 38 total verses, so just hang with me. We'll walk through here, and this is where Esther plays the role of petitioner. She's going to actually go before the king and petition him to save her people. So it's pretty dramatic. It's pretty fun reading. And from it, we're going to draw some information about our own lives, especially like those of us who really struggle in the area of pride and arrogance and kind of seeing ourselves in a very exalted, exaggerated way. And also we struggle with, in terms of just being humble, that it seems like those who are arrogant, that they seem to get further ahead in life. And sometimes we wrestle with that. Well, all of this comes into play in these 3 chapters. So having said all of that, I want to do 3 things. We're going to see, first of all, that Esther is going to invite the king and Haman to 2 different feasts. In fact, if you've been paying attention, you recognize that throughout the book of Esther, that feasts are very important. In fact, you see the feast of the king and the queen in the first 2 chapters. And then when Esther is selected, he throws a feast for her. And then Esther now is going to do a couple of feasts to appeal to the king, perhaps recognizing that the way to the king's heart is through his stomach. Some women believe that about men. And then he had these number of feasts. And the book will actually end with a feast that is still celebrated today in Judaism, the Feast of Purim. And we'll talk about that in the future. So having said all of that, let's jump right in here to chapter 5. So just remember, it was a little bit of a cliffhanger. Last time we were together, so Esther agrees, ask people to fast, but I'm going in. All right, no reference to prayer or to God. It's the way the author is saying sometimes God seems unseen, unheard, but we're going to see he's very active in the background. So what happens? On the 3rd day, chapter 5, verse 1, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. This is the moment. Like she's either going to live or die. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor. That's that word we said early on was so significant. This is the word for grace. She won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." And then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther has asked." And so the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." And then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor," again, that word great, "if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Now, we'll keep reading here in just a moment, but let's pause and say that really, after all of chapter 4, this feels a little anticlimactic. I mean, it's like, okay, this whole big moment, like what will happen? Well, it's described in very few verses. And so she shows herself, and the king immediately extends the scepter, and she comes in like no problem, like it was no big deal. And I think that one of the things that the author, writing under the inspiration of God, I think that what he is doing literally here is trying to call attention to the fact that what we think from our perspective, this is the big deal, really it's something that's unheard and unseen. That the real drama, as we're about to see, is happening behind the curtains of the stage. Unseen, but yet are going to be very dramatic. And so this scene of Esther approaching the king does feel a little bit anticlimactic. In fact, the first thing I want you to consider this morning is this, is that in a godless story, if your perspective is that there is no God present, God is not at work. In a godless story, heroes can feel on their own. Heroes can feel like they're on their own in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. But what we're going to see unfold is the second statement, that in God's story, heroes are never alone. In God's story, those who commit themselves and take risky steps for the purposes of God and for his glory, they're never alone. That God is at work, many times in silent, unseen ways. Okay, let's watch how this unfolds. So in verse 9 of chapter 5, it says, "And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai." Now you remember that from chapter 3. That's what set Haman off. That the king had passed an edict that everybody should pay homage and bow down to Mordecai, to Haman, the second highest in the kingdom. And you remember those words are unique when they're used together. It really had the idea of worship. And so Haman is really really putting himself up there in a big way. And he wants people to respect him at that level. And Mordecai, just a good Jew here, refuses to do it. So here Haman leaves the feast with the king and the queen. And he's pretty happy until he sees Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman, verse 10, restrained himself, went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them, watch all this. He recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. And then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast that she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate." And then his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it, and then go joyfully with the king to the feast." And this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. This is pretty incredible. Hey, I'll just go and hang the guy, and then just go celebrate in the feast. That's the advice from his wife. And so we see him really struggling here. Now, I'm going to read you 3 more verses. Okay, let's move into chapter 6. "And on that night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, 'What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' And the king's young men who attended him said, 'Nothing has been done for him.'" Okay, so if you weren't with us back in chapter 3, or at the end of chapter 2, we get this little scene of Mordecai being at the king's gate. He overhears a conspiracy to assassinate the king. He reports it through Esther to the king. They explore it, they investigate it, they find it's true. The 2 guys that were conspiring are executed. And you think, man, Mordecai's really going to be rewarded. He's really going to be recognized and promoted. But nothing happens. Nothing. Just like it just kind of passes and nothing is done. And so now you fast forward ahead, and in the providence of God, on the night that Haman is having the gallows constructed to hang Mordecai, the king wakes up, or because he's asleep, he finds out what Mordecai's done. And so now he is thinking, how can I honor the man whom Haman is preparing to hang? Okay? And so this whole thing is this setup, this work of God, so that now the king wants to honor the one whom Haman wants to hang. So all of this is kind of a setup. This is a providence of God that the king has this sleepless night and discovers this act that had never been rewarded. It's pretty fascinating. So the second thing I want you to consider is that in God's story, heroes are never alone. That Esther doesn't know that if she's laying out this plan to appeal to the king on behalf of her people. She's taking risky steps coming in. She's setting up these 2 different feasts. Like she's working a plan. And sometimes you feel like you're working just on your own, like you're all alone. But meanwhile, God is doing something in a really big way, something that would surprise you if you knew about it. Esther, she doesn't know about this. What God is doing and setting up all of this backstory with Haman and Mordecai. There's a story that I love to tell. I actually heard from Terry Spinelli, one of our missionaries that we support. And when Terry Spinelli was in Moscow, he was with Campus Crusade for Christ, now known as Cru. And he was in Moscow, and one of the things they were doing is working with an institution called St. James. It was a Bible teaching, Bible college. And this wasn't long after the fall of the wall and the Soviet Union breakup. And for the first time, they were letting believers come into the country. A lot of evangelism was taking place. It was a pretty incredible time. And Terry tells a story that there was a team, a part of the crusade team, that went up into an area of Russia, and it was called Tula, is the name of the city, and they were going to do this evangelistic outreach. And so they approached the mayor of the city about getting permission for a site venue, and the mayor gave permission for it, and then happened to mention that, hey, you know what, we've got this big warehouse full of Bibles that were kind of collected during the days of Stalin. Would y'all be interested in them? And the leader says, sure, of course. And so they go and they rent a truck and they just grab some guys off the street and offer to pay them some money to help load these Bibles up. One of these men was a guy named Volodya. And so they go into the warehouse, they pull the tarps off and whatever coverings they had, and they start working. And after a while, they can't find Volodya. And they're looking for him. And they start exploring around the warehouse, and he's in the corner of the building. And he's just crying. He said, Volodya, what's going on? And he said through tears, he said, I just pulled this tarp off, this mound of Bibles, and the first one that fell down into my hands, I opened up, and it's my grandmother's Bible. She had been sent to the Gulag by Stalin and died when he was 3 years old. Had all the family names. And then it was a prayer, God save my grandson, Volodya. And that day, Volodya bowed his head and prayed to receive Jesus Christ right there. You know, you can plan an outreach event. You can budget for it, get a site. You can work the plan, and sometimes in hard venues, you could feel like you're just doing this all on your own. And little do we know what God is doing behind the scenes, arranging things to happen, things that we would never imagine. He's just preparing the soil. He's preparing people to hear. He's doing all kinds of things. And so when we are taking the risky steps like Esther, we must realize that risky as they may feel, there's all this activity and drama that God is doing behind the scenes. And, that's what Esther will eventually discover. Right now, she doesn't know it. And so we come back to the text, and we see that not only the table has been spread in terms of who all is going to come, but now the table is set. And what I mean by that is the table is set up. God is now going to put together some things that will make this next feast very, very interesting. And that happens here in chapter 7. And let's see, where did I leave off here? Yeah. So the king, back in chapter 6, Haman shows up. We're still in chapter 6, so Haman shows up, right? So he goes to the king because he's going to get the king's permission to hang Haman. And the king is thinking, I want to honor Mordecai. Haman wants to hang him. And so the king has asked what's been done for Mordecai, and they answer nothing. And the king said, verse 4 of chapter 6, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, Haman is there standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Now, this is the third time we've seen the word honor, which moves all through these 3 chapters. Okay? He says, what should be done to the man whom the king wants to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Okay, so here we see the hubris of Haman, and he's just, sure that the king's talking about him. And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse throughout the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And this is pretty incredible. And so Haman thinking, I'm going to be the one that he's talking about me. So we can see a window into Haman's heart. What is it that he really longs for? Like, I want to approach as near as I can to royalty. Like, I want to wear the king's robes. Like, I want to wear the king's crown. I want to ride on the king's horse. And I want to be paraded and announced, like, here's the man that the king wants to honor. So this is what Haman wants done to himself. And, it kind of like teaches us something here. For example, the next step I would encourage you to make note of is that in a godless story, just from an earth point of view, a godless story, the proud pursue honor with blind ambition. The proud pursue honor with blind ambition. There's a lot that Haman's not picking up on. Like, he's about to be humiliated, and it doesn't stop here, and he fails to read the signs. His ambition is so blind. He wants to be exalted so much. The second thing, though, is that in God's story, the proud are humbled by God's opposition. The proud are humbled by God's opposition. Now, before we look at that, let's just think about this for a moment. Like, do you ever wrestle with wanting people to think highly of you? And so you're willing maybe to stretch a story a little bit. You're willing to exaggerate something. Like, have you ever said, man, I just want people to perceive our family as perfect. And so we're not going to share what's really going on. When we're going to go to our small group, and we're not going to share a prayer request about, man, we're really struggling with a daughter who's, moving in a rebellious direction, because we really want to be perceived as great parents. We don't want to open up and say, you know what, we have this issue that we struggle with from time to time in our marriage. So we don't want anyone to think there's any cracks, and so we're not going to actually go to a marriage class that would really, really help us. We're not really going to talk to a marriage counselor, because we have a perception, and we want to be thought of in a certain way. Some people just can't say they're sorry, because to say you're sorry is to admit you did something wrong. Oh no, I don't do things wrong. I'm always right. Like, some of this, you can't relate to maybe a guy like Haman who's going to wipe out an entire people. But we can relate to this, can't we? We can relate to that same kind of hubris, that same kind of conceit, that same kind of desire for self-promotion, image management. Like, that's what we do. We're just like him. We share the heart of Haman. And so, that's what happens. And sometimes when you're looking through the perspective that God's not really active, that God's not really present, you may be tempted to say, that I'm just going to pursue and give vent to my proud ambition. But it's blind ambition in many, many ways. And so as we continue reading, in God's story, the proud are humbled by God's opposition. Because as soon as Haman finishes describing the way he would like to be honored, then the king said to Haman in verse 10, hurry and take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. This is the arch enemy of Haman. the very one that he wants to hang. And he says, quick, go do this with Mordecai. Can you just feel that? Can you feel for a moment what that must have felt like for Haman? Oh, you're not talking about me? Mordecai? You've got to be kidding me. Can you imagine the internal response that was going on? He'd never say it to the king. Oh my goodness, how humiliating for Haman. And so the king said, hurry, take the robes, do so to Mordecai. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. And then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, now watch how she just completely turns her story. She's the one who said, you ought to build the gallows of hanging. Then Zeresh said to him, hey, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Now, that's interesting. I mean, she almost functions in the role of prophet. If you can remember, we've said that the background for much of Esther, the deliverance of God's people, follows from God's promise to Abraham, the father of the Jews. Remember that? Let me show that to you again in Genesis 12. Remember how the Lord called Abram, told him to go from his father's house and from his land. And then verse 2, I'll make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And remember, the blessing that would come through the Jews is the Messiah, Jesus Christ, whose death on the cross would bring blessing to the whole world, to all who believe in him. And then he finishes by saying, I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. In other words, Mordecai knew, as we learned earlier, that whether Esther stepped up or not, God would deliver them somehow because of this promise. And here Zeresh basically says, if Mordecai is a Jew, you're not going to win over him. It was pretty amazing, again, just kind of bolstering this idea that God, the proud are humbled by God's opposition. Okay, so here's the big deal. That's what's going on. There's a third thing, though, that I want you to consider, and it's not in your notes, but it's kind of the positive side of this same idea. In God's story, the humble are honored at God's discretion. The proud, the humble are honored at God's discretion. What I mean by that is that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that when God does that is up to him. It's his discretion about that. As we saw, Mordecai was not honored after he exposed the assassination. It was years later that he's finally honored. And the timing of these things we never know. Let me remind you of 1 Peter chapter 5. And verse 5 and 7, it says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. I love that. Like God fixes the time. And so we can either through self-promotion try to get ourselves out there, or God says that you live with humility, considering others better than yourselves, Philippians chapter 2, serving people, in that you wait for God's timing for him to exalt you or place you or position you or to reward you or to recognize you. That's the way that God works. A story is told of a couple who was retiring from the mission field in Africa. And now in their old years, after a whole career of sharing the gospel and ministering to the poor, building churches, now they're coming back home. And it just so happened that was February 7th, 1964. They were on Pan Am Flight 102 out of London. And it just so happened that it was the same flight the Beatles were flying in on when they entered the United States that first time. And if you've seen the video, or perhaps some of you saw it live, when the plane rolls in JFK, the place just goes wild. There are teenagers and girls just fainting, and they're all lined up on different levels of the airport watching, looking down. The media are crazy. I mean, it's just bizarre. It's the circus, and the cheering is so wild, and the Beatles are blown away. They really didn't know how they were going to be received in America, but man, they were just met with all this fanfare. You just couldn't believe it. And sometime after they had finally gotten down the steps, this missionary couple comes off, and no one's there to greet them. And so they make their way down and try to get through the crowd. And they're walking eventually toward this apartment that the denomination had gotten for them, this small apartment. And the man's face is just growing increasingly sour, just struggling. And the wife sees it, as women often do. They just pick up on what's going on, and he's just struggling. And he gets home, and he just goes into the bedroom, closes the door, and just starts praying. After a little while, he comes back out, and his face is a little lighter, his countenance is lighter, and his wife said, "You seem like you're doing better. What happened?" He said, "Well, I was back there, and I was telling God, I said, God, we served you for over 30 years on this mission field, and we come back and there's not even one person to greet us. We come home, there's no fanfare. We've been gone, and we come home and there's no recognition. We come home and we're just confronted with this frivolous band and getting all this attention, and what do we have? We have nothing, and our homecoming was nothing like what we should have been." And he just kind of wrestles with this, and then he just gets quiet before God. And he says to his wife, "It's as if God said to me very clearly, but son, you're not home yet." And for many of us who may feel like, I just live kind of a quiet, meek, humble life, just trying to be faithful to God, loving my wife, loving my husband, raising my kids, serving the body of Christ, trying to share the gospel as God gives me opportunity. Like, I'm just living my life, and I don't really get a whole lot of attention. The day's going to come when Jesus Christ is going to stand before you and say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Because you've been faithful in a few things, I will make you ruler over many things. Come and enter into the joy of the Lord." And what we learn here from this whole experience with Haman and Mordecai is that those who try to exalt themselves and promote themselves, especially to the harm of others, God opposes them, will oppose them. But those who are humble, who try to serve God's purposes, that God will exalt them in due time, in his way and in his time. We need to move quickly to the last part of this thing, because this is where it gets almost comedic, except that a man gets hung. So in chapter 7, we see the tables are turned, okay? So I want you to think in terms of poetic justice. If you're familiar with some of these literary terms, we would call it teleonic justice. The idea that, man, the tables are turned. Sometimes we would say, you get what you got, or what you dished out comes back to you. That's that whole deal. In pop culture, we might say, borrowing from Eastern religion, karma. It's the idea that, man, things get twisted on you and you suffer this thing. This is what happens. So in chapter 7, we read, first of all, at the very end is chapter 6, the very ominous deal that Zeresh tells him, you're going to fall before Mordecai. And then it says, while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Now, at this point, things move rapidly, and it's just kind of this ominous setting, tone for Haman. And so they're come and get him, and they bring him to the feast. He's still reeling over what happened in leading Mordecai through the city. So the king and Haman went in to the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. And if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? And where is he who dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, the wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Can you guys see this scene? So you're in this banquet. It's just the three of you. And Haman's listening. And he starts putting things together. Oh my goodness, Queen Esther is a Jew. And she puts this out. And then he hears the king said, "Who is the man who would dare do this?" Like, how is Haman feeling at this moment? It's not a good day for Haman. Not a good day. And the king cannot believe it. Esther points him out. This wicked foe, Haman. Now, it even gets funnier. "And the king arose," verse 7, "in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king." Now, one of the things is that you're to never be alone with a woman from the harem, much less the queen. Okay, so when the king steps out of the room, like out on the patio, like the last thing that Haman should do is throw himself at the queen, begging for mercy. And he's in this compromised position when the king walks back in. And the king returned, verse 8, from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. And then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, as they were escorting him out of the room, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." Now, can you imagine, like, Haman, you know you're dead. And then this guy mentions on your way out, "Oh, by the way, king, he's constructed these gallows. He was going to hang Mordecai, the guy that you just honored." And Haman's probably saying, "Would you just shut up?" Like, it really is kind of comical at this point. But God is working to twist this whole thing on Haman, turning the tables. And the king said, "Hang him on that." And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the wrath of the king abated. Two things. In a godless story, the proud pursue vengeance for personal offense. For personal offense. Remember, that's at the core of this whole thing. All the way back to chapter 2. Mordecai wouldn't bow before Haman. And so Haman basically sets this whole thing in motion. The proud pursue vengeance. He wants his vengeance on Mordecai. And then he extrapolates from that, extends that to all of the people. And we can do the same thing. When we live in a godless worldview, that we don't think God is present, and we feel like that there are those who have dissed us, which is, disrespected us. We see this played out perhaps in gang culture, inner city. Like, if you're dissed, if you're disrespected, like some of these, they just kill you. Now you think, well, we don't do that, but what do? Sometimes if I'm disrespected, you're disrespected, we may shun a person. We may sue a person. We may do whatever we can to give them some degree of pain that they have caused us. And so it's whether it's using gossip or slander, lawsuits, whatever is at our disposal. Many times we may not act out, but it's in our heart that we wish that they would suffer. That's what we want. And what we're reminded here is that God's point of view is really different. Because in a godless story, it's not that the bad don't get what's coming. It's just that they don't get it from us. They get it from God. God says, do not take vengeance out in your own hand, because vengeance comes from the Lord. Let me show it to you, Romans 12. Romans 12 says, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And so we trust God in his providence. Sometimes in time and space, and sometimes in the future, we're like, God's going to make right those who have done wrong toward us, toward God's people, that in his providence, and when he does, it's the turning of the tables. So we're in the presence of a gas shortage, right? Right? Some of you don't believe that. But somehow it got hyped out there, and Thursday night there were the longest lines in all the gas stations, and some of you sat there in them. My wife was one who sat in there for over an hour. We were going to the fundraising thing for Restoration Blessing, and I said, well, I'll just meet you there, because she had to get gas, and so she's in this long line. She's finally texting me, I'm finally on my way, but I've got a wild story for you. Turns out that there was almost a mob fight that breaks out. And she's in line. She's finally come up, advanced behind one person. And when he finishes filling up, he has to back up a little bit to get out. And so Kathy has to back up, and the car behind her has to back up, and the car behind that car has to back up. But this car, sensing an opening from people reversing, whips around right in front of Kathy to the pump. Okay, so she's been in there for an hour waiting. People who witness this get out of their car and start yelling at this guy. And start saying, hey, what are you doing? This is terrible. And like they're filming, and we're putting this on social media. And like, man, they're like giving this guy a really hard time. And he's saying, what? Like, I didn't know there was an order or something like that. And Kathy gets out, my wife. She says, well, I can't believe you did that, but because I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, I'm not going to say what I really want to say or do what I really want to do. Like she's going to take him out, Anyway, the whole thing gets really wild. And so he goes inside. He's got to pay cash. And so he pays, and he comes back out, put the gas in his car, and he can't get the thing to work. He can't, and it's like everybody's kind of watching and on the left. He couldn't get the thing to work. He goes back inside, and he finds out that the cash he put down, that the attendant credited somebody else's car. And so we end up paying for the gas in someone else's car, and he comes back out and he says, I can't believe it. She put my money on somebody else's car. And people are hearing that, and they're going, ha, that's what you deserve, karma. And then they all start yelling, karma, karma, karma. Case is hysterical. And so then he has to give the $30 again, and he's putting it in, and his car would only hold $20. And so there's $10 left, and he just laid the thing down, and he said to Kathy, you want the $10 gas? Because it's already on there. And so he drives off, and Kathy gets $10. I said, you've got to be kidding. That fits this message so well. That is just a perfect illustration. I love you, Kathy. You just provide such great material. Anyway, God has a way of doing that. And let me just say, as we kind of wind this message down, is that what is significant about God's intervention here is that his plan of salvation for you and for me and our children and our grandchildren, as well as the whole world, was contingent on one day the Messiah, Jesus Christ, being born and living a perfect life and going to the cross. And the significance of that is this, is that for all of you who suffer with the temptation of pride, and all of us who wrestle with arrogance or wanting praise, wanting to be respected, wanting to be noticed, and willing to do whatever we need to do in order to get that, all of us who have sinned in that way, those whom God said he opposes, that opposition was placed on Jesus when he went to the cross. He absorbed God's wrath towards sinful man. And so none of us have to experience the penalty for our pride if we place our trust in Jesus. Because he paid the penalty for our pride. And when he takes up residence in our life, when we place our faith in Christ, he changes us. That's our God, that he loves us. So Hattie, the proud hen, is humbled, and she returns to her family and says, I'm a lucky little hen, a plain little hen, but a lucky hen am I. I'm glad to be living with friends so forgiving and a master who loves me nearby. Let's pray. Father, we just give you thanks for the way you're dealing with us, and that, God, that you call us to humble ourselves before you. We're reminded, Lord, how Jesus said that he humbled himself, that he left his home in heaven and all the perks of privileges of deity, that he humbled himself to become a servant who would die on a cross for us. And Lord, because of what Jesus did for us, that we can have brand new life and forgiveness for all the pride and arrogance in our life, of trying to project ourselves as something we're not, demanding people react to us in ways. But God, just help us trust that you're at work behind everything. And so we live humble and heroic lives for your purposes. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.